The bright sun illuminated the quiet street, where the scents of freshly baked bread and damp grass wafted through the air. The world seemed perfect, especially for little Amara, who was to go to kindergarten for the first time that day. Her dark chocolate eyes sparkled with delight, and a radiant smile played on her lips. She wasn't just happy, she was full of hope that this day would be the beginning of something great. Amara had always dreamed of going to kindergarten. She looked enviously at the neighborhood children running merrily with backpacks behind their backs. Now it was her turn. She was wearing her best dress, soft pink, with lace, which she carefully stroked with her little hands so as not to wrinkle. Her shoes glistened in the sun as if to say, "Look how beautiful she is." "Are you ready, my princess?" Mom asked, adjusting her little backpack. Her voice was warm, full of love and slight concern. "Ready," Amara replied, squaring her shoulders and straightening her back. Her childlike confidence was genuine. They walked hand in hand, enjoying the morning walk. Amara's mother looked beautiful. Her austere but elegant outfit emphasized her strength and dignity. She chose her words with care, trying to explain to her daughter how important it was to be polite, friendly, and diligent in her studies. But most importantly, she wanted Amara to know that she deserved respect just like any other child. "Mom, what's it going to be like in there?" the girl asked, wide-eyed, looking at her face. "There will be lots of other children there," Mom began with a smile. "You will play, learn, and make new friends. Teachers will help you learn something new every day. Do you think I'll find a friend there?" Amara's voice was filled with hope. "Of course, honey. You are a smart, kind, and beautiful girl. Everyone will only have eyes for you," Mom said lovingly, squeezing her hand lightly. The kindergarten appeared on the horizon, decorated with bright banners and colorful balloons. It looked welcoming, like a real home for little ones. Amara slowed her step to take a closer look at the building. Her heart beat faster, her eyes shone even brighter. "Is this here?" she asked. "Yes, this is your new world," Mom replied, kissing her on the top of her head. They stopped at the door. Inside they could hear the cheerful voices of children, laughter, and the melodious jingling of toys. Everything about the place called to her to come in and be part of this friendly, bright atmosphere. But Amara's mother, feeling a strange chill inside, still hesitated slightly. It was a faint shadow of doubt that flashed in her eyes before they entered. Perhaps it was just instinct, or perhaps a premonition of what awaited them next. Amara didn't notice it. She eagerly reached for the door, sure that something incredible awaited behind it. She didn't know yet that behind her happy smile she would soon have to hide disappointment and tears. The kindergarten door creaked softly, letting in the morning light and two new visitors. Amara, full of joy and confidence, stepped forward, holding her mother's hand tightly. Inside the hall, everything seemed magical. Brightly colored walls decorated with children's drawings, small tables arranged in perfect order, toys that seemed to be waiting to be played with. The girl couldn't take her eyes off this revitalized world of fairy tales. But the magic was interrupted as soon as a middle-aged woman with a cold stare and a stern expression approached them. It was the director of the kindergarten, Ms. Clark. Tall, with perfectly gathered hair, she was the epitome of sternness and self-assurance. Her gaze slid over Amara's mother, lingered on the child, and immediately darkened. It was a momentary but palpable judgment. She even furrowed her brow slightly, as if she saw something inappropriate. "Good morning, Ms. Clark," Amara's mother began with a slight smile. "We're here to meet you. Today is my daughter's first day." Ms. Clark looked at them again, her lips forming a thin line. She was silent for a few seconds, as if considering whether to continue the conversation. Finally, she spoke, her voice dry. devoid of any warmth. Okay. Is this, your daughter?" She paused deliberately, as if she couldn't believe her mother was serious. "Yes, this is Amara. We've already applied and received confirmation. She's very happy to be here today," the mother replied, trying to ignore the principal's strange tone. Amara looked at Ms. Clark expectantly. She expected a smile, maybe even a welcoming handshake. Instead, the principal tilted her head slightly and squinted her eyes as if checking something. We usually accept children who meet our—" She hesitated, searching for a word. "Standards." Amara's mother frowned. Her face remained calm, but there was wariness in her eyes. "And what are those standards, if I may ask?" She spoke in an even tone, but every syllable sounded like a challenge. "Well?" Miss Clark took a step back, as if she were going to hide behind her authority. "We try to provide our children with a comfortable and, shall we say, balanced environment. Sometimes, different cultural differences can create certain difficulties for the team." "Cultural differences?" Amara's mother did not raise her voice, but her tone was clearly threatening. Amara stared in surprise, not understanding why the conversation had become so tense. She tried to catch Ms. Clark's gaze, to show that she was willing to be part of this balanced environment, but the principal looked at her as if she were a stranger who happened to be on her doorstep. "Look, Ms. Clark." The mother took her daughter's hand a little tighter, as if protecting her. "My daughter is a smart, kind, and well-behaved girl. She's no different from any of the other children who study here." Miss Clark lifted her chin slightly, as if she wanted to look taller. "That's commendable, of course," her words were imbued with false courtesy. "But sometimes, children, with different experiences, it's hard for them to adapt, especially if they—" She paused again. "Look different. It may not be familiar to other parents." Amara's mother felt rage rising in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe steady. She knew now was not the time to lose control. "My daughter does not interfere with other children," she said firmly. "If someone is uncomfortable with her appearance, that's that person's problem, not our family's." The principal squinted, her face hard as stone. "I'm sorry, but at my daycare center, I'm in charge of harmony. And maybe your daughter, she's just not a good fit." The words struck like a whip. Amara, who had been listening to the conversation with innocent interest, suddenly felt tears come to her eyes. She didn't understand why her mother had to prove that she was worthy of being here. Ms. Clark, noticing this, did not soften. Her gaze only grew colder. "We can't risk our community for the sake of experiments," she added. Amara's mother squeezed her daughter's hand and looked at the principal with a long look. "We're not an experiment, Miss Clark. We're a family. And we're not leaving until my daughter is treated with respect." Miss Clark remained silent, her face tense like a string ready to burst. The silence between them was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But Amara's mom knew this was only the beginning of the battle. Instead of the warm welcome that the bright signs on the front of the kindergarten and the colorful brochures promised, Amara and her mother were met with icy indifference. Ms. Clark didn't even offer them a seat, but gestured to a small table in the corner, as if they were unwelcome guests that she wanted to get rid of as quickly as possible. Their presence seemed to disrupt the usual order. There was a pile of papers behind the desk, rules, statements, documents that needed to be signed. But Ms. Clark took her time explaining exactly what needed to be done. She stood to the side, watching them with an expression on her face that would be more befitting a person looking at something unpleasant and inappropriate. Her posture said it all. Arms crossed over her chest, raised eyebrow, slightly compressed lips. She seemed to be waiting for an excuse to refuse, so she wouldn't waste any more time with inappropriate visitors. Time dragged agonizingly slowly. Amara's mother patiently leafed through the papers, trying to ignore the discomfort she felt. Yet the tension in the air was almost palpable. It seemed that even the walls of this kindergarten, painted in bright colors, refused to accept them. As Amara's mother filled out the forms, Miss Clark's gaze slid inexorably over their appearance. She noticed everything: Amara's dark skin tone, her thick curls, carefully braided into neat pigtails by her mother, their discreet but clean and stylish clothes. Her eyes were quiet but unconcealed criticism. It was as if she were trying to find faults where there were none, to confirm her inner prejudice. Amara, whose joy was fading, sat next to her mother, gripping the edge of her chair. She could feel that intense gaze, even if she couldn't understand its meaning. The girl still hoped that the situation would change, that something good was about to happen, that this place would become what she had imagined it to be. But instead, she felt small and insignificant, as if she was a mistake who had accidentally walked in here. Ms. Clark continued to create an atmosphere of uneasiness. She ostentatiously reviewed the documents, checking them over and over again, as if she were looking for something to pick on. Once she even returned one of the forms to Amara's mother with a short, dry remark that something was wrong. A fleeting smirk flickered across her face, as if she were enjoying the process. Other parents who entered the building with their children noticed the scene. Some slowed their steps, casting curious and sometimes unfriendly glances at Amara and her mother. A couple of the mothers even exchanged quiet but meaningful words, pointing at the girl. These whispers flew around the room like poison arrows, burning Amara's mother with her helplessness. Amara felt like a stranger for the first time in this place that was supposed to be her second home. Her innocent, childlike eyes no longer sparkled with joy as they had in the morning. She furtively looked around, trying to figure out why everything looked so cold and hostile. Why no one was smiling at her? Why did she feel different from the others? Amara's mother tried to keep her cool. Her pride prevented her from showing how much this humiliating reception hurt her. She understood that Miss Clark was deliberately stretching the process, making it clear that they were unwelcome. She realized that every gesture, every glance was drenched in contempt and implicit racism. But the mother knew she had to be strong for her daughter. Her silent dignity, however, did not soften Miss Clark. On the contrary, she seemed annoyed by this firmness. Her prejudice became more and more noticeable. She seemed to genuinely believe that families like theirs simply could not be part of her ideal institution. And the longer this scene went on, the more one felt the gulf Miss Clark had created between herself and them. Eventually, the waiting became unbearable. Amara shrank back in her chair, as if trying to become invisible. Her happiness that she had brought here since morning had evaporated, leaving only a lump in her throat and a bitter feeling of being unwanted. It was the first time in her life that she had experienced that even in a child's world there could be room for prejudice. Her mother finished filling out the paperwork and handed it to Miss Clark, who took it coldly without even looking at the woman. There was no hint of greeting in her face, only silent approval of her authority. She didn't utter a word, but her actions read everything. "You are superfluous here. You will never be a part of this world." Amara, following her mother to the exit, couldn't help but look back at this beautiful but hostile place. She could no longer see the magic in it, only indifference and coldness. Amara's mother finished filling out the paperwork, trying to ignore Miss Clark's pointed glances. Amara sat next to her, clinging tightly to her mother, as if trying to find protection from this alien and cruel world. The tension in the air seemed to have peaked, but the real blow was yet to come. Ms. Clark took the completed forms, ran her eyes over them, and stacked them. She set them down on the edge of the table with emphasized slowness. then straightened up and crossed her arms over her chest. Her gaze was cold and piercing. It was as if she were trying to burn through mother and child with her contemptuous, appraising stance. "I looked at your papers carefully," she said at last. Her voice sounded dry, detached, as if she were talking to unnecessary objects rather than to living people. "And I have to tell you that we can't accept your daughter." The words, spoken so calmly and nonchalantly, struck like lightning. Amara froze, her small hands clutching the hem of her mother's dress. Her eyes filled with incomprehension and fear. She couldn't understand why anyone would refuse her. She just wanted to play, learn, and make friends. "We have very high standards," Miss Clark continued, as if to state the obvious. "And we choose children who can meet those standards." She didn't elaborate on what she meant, but her gaze spoke more than words. Her eyes slid over Amara's dark skin, over the curly hair her mother had carefully braided that morning. That look, full of hidden judgment, was like a slap in the face. Amara's mother remained calm outwardly, but inside she was seething. She didn't let her emotions get the best of her for her daughter, who already looked depressed. "I'm sorry, but what exactly do you mean by high standards?" she asked in an even tone, holding back her anger. Ms. Clark pretended not to hear the direct question. Instead, she continued, "We have a wonderful community of parents and children. They have similar values, cultural experiences, and habits. We have to make sure that every new student fits in, and I'm afraid that's not possible in this case." Her words sounded almost like memorized text, but their meaning was obvious. Amara didn't fit in for a single reason, because of her skin color and background. It had nothing to do with her mental capacity, her character, or anything else. It was blatant racism disguised as high standards. Amara sat quietly, trying to figure out what was going on. Her little heart squeezed painfully. She couldn't realize why she had been so rudely rejected. She just wanted to be a part of this world that seemed so beautiful to her. Her mother took a deep breath, trying to cope with the emotion that had come over her. She had already seen enough to know that Miss Clark would not change her mind. The principal had done everything she could to show that Amara wasn't welcome here, and it wasn't about papers or standards at all. At that moment, several children ran out of the neighboring hallway. They were laughing and shouting, holding hands. When they saw Amara, some of them slowed their steps. Their gazes, the same as the adults, were full of curiosity mixed with incomprehension. One of the boys even pulled his mother's hand to point at Amara. "Mom, why is that girl so strange?" he asked loudly, unashamedly. His mother, instead of correcting the child, laughed quietly, as if in agreement. Those words stabbed into Amara's heart like a knife. She lowered her eyes, trying not to look at the people around her. She no longer felt part of this place. She felt alien, as if her existence was a mistake in itself. Miss Clark seemed to be enjoying this moment. Her gaze became even more stern and her voice even more icy. "I think you'd be better off finding a place more suited to your—" She paused as if choosing the word circumstances. She paused as if searching for a word. Circumstances. "Perhaps something more suitable for your girl. Here, she's going to have a hard time. Difficult." With those words, she took a step back, as if she were putting an end to this humiliating conversation. At that moment, the doors that should have opened for Amara were slammed in her face. The mother hugged her daughter tightly, trying to shield her from this harsh world. But Amara could already feel that cold truth. She was not a part of this place, and perhaps not just this one. Those doors closed not only physically, they closed symbolically, leaving the girl with the feeling that she had no right to be equal to others. Ms. Clark's cold words hung in the air like an inexorable sentence, but the humiliation of Amara and her mother didn't end there. As the principal returned the completed paperwork, as if to symbolically push it back, a group of parents began to gather around. They stood in small groups, but their gazes were directed at the mother and child. Amara could feel those gazes, prickling like thorns, and it seemed impossible for her to hide from them. The whispering began almost immediately. One of the men, holding his son's hand, leaned toward the woman beside him, and their conversation turned to barely restrained giggling. The other couple, who were watching, didn't even try to hide their wry grin. "They came here, did they?" One of the women whispered loudly, deliberately loud enough to be heard. Her voice was filled with contempt. "They probably thought they'd be accepted," another replied, pretending to adjust her coat. "But this isn't a neighborhood daycare center. It's not like that here." The words hurt Amara's mother, but she gave herself no right to show weakness. She straightened up proudly, even though she was seething with anger. Amara, on the other hand, shrank back, trying to hide behind her mother. She realized that all these people were looking at her with a strange judgment, as if she were a stranger. Don't they realize that such children will not be able to adapt? The third woman added, leaning slightly toward her friend. "It's ridiculous. It's pathetic." The whispering grew louder and louder, even though they were formally trying to hide it. It seemed that every adult here felt it was their duty to express an opinion about the family that dared to cross the threshold of their institution. But it was especially painful to see the children who imitated their parents. Some of them were standing around, looking at Amara and whispering, not realizing that their words and gestures were destroying her fragile world. "Look at her skin," whispered one of the boys, pointing his finger at her. "Is she even like us?" "No," the girl next to him answered confidently. "She's weird." Amara's mother heard all this, but pretended not to notice. She held her daughter's hand, trying to protect her from those cruel looks and words. But it was impossible to ignore how the parents continued to discuss them, not shying away from showing their bias. "It will only cause problems," one of the men, dressed in an expensive suit, said loudly. "I don't want my son to grow up in such an environment. It's clearly not his level." These words, spoken almost publicly, elicited quiet chuckles from the crowd. Even Ms. Clark, standing aside, made no attempt to intervene or stop this humiliating spectacle. Her icy silence only fueled the feeling that such behavior was not only tolerated but encouraged here. Amara, feeling completely naked under those gazes, clung to her mother. Her eyes filled with tears, which she struggled to hold back. But how does a 9-year-old realize that nothing is her fault? How do you understand why adults can be so cruel? The mother tried not to show her pain, but inside her anger flared up. She realized that they were being humiliated not only as people, but also as individuals, trying to rob them of their dignity. It was open, blatant racism, which everyone preferred to keep silent about, as if it were the norm. Another woman standing next to Miss Clark leaned over to her and said loudly, "I hope you don't change your mind. This environment is not for us. It's not what we bring our children here for." Ms. Clark nodded with a barely perceptible chuckle, as if confirming her words. Amara couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She sobbed quietly, hiding her face in her mother's dress. But even that became an object of ridicule. One of her parents chuckled. "She's also crying." Of course, kids like that will always feel out of place. That moment was the final point of humiliation. Even the building itself, bright and attractive from the outside, now seemed dark and threatening to Amara. This place that was supposed to be her second home had become a symbol of resentment, cruelty, and injustice. The mother hugged her daughter tightly and lifted her into her arms. She could no longer let these people hurt her. But there was still a fire in her heart. She knew they wouldn't just leave here. They would show these people who Amara and her family were. But right now, she needed to do the most important thing of all: protect her daughter from this cruelty, even if she had to leave to do it. A strong gust of cold wind hit Amara's mother in the face as she walked out of the kindergarten building, holding her daughter's hand. A storm of emotions raged inside her: rage, resentment, powerlessness. Her throat constricted, as if an invisible hand had grabbed her throat, preventing her from taking a full breath. Every derogatory word, every taunt, every scornful look from her parents and Miss Clark seemed to poison the air around her. But she knew that her first priority now was to keep Amara from feeling the poison. Amara seemed to be completely overwhelmed. She no longer tried to look around. Her large, dark eyes were fixed on the ground, and her face was flooded with tears. Her mother, looking at her, felt a pain piercing her heart. It wasn't just fear for her child. It was the deep, primal pain of a mother seeing the world destroy her child's innocence. They walked a few meters until they reached the nearest bench in a small public garden nearby. The mother sat Amara down, knelt down in front of her, and put her arms around her. Her daughter clung to her shoulder, sobbing quietly but convulsively. Her mother stroked her head, trying to comfort her, but she realized that words were powerless. Tears choked her, but she didn't let them come out. She closed her eyes, trying to find a modicum of peace. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a prayer began to form, not loud but insistent, like a cry from her soul. "God, give me strength," she said mentally, clutching her daughter's hands in her own. "Give me the patience and courage to endure this humiliation. I can't show her my weakness because if I break, who will protect her?" Her faith had always been an anchor for her, a comfort in the darkest of times. And now, in spite of all the injustice and malice that had just descended upon them, she turned to that faith as her last support. She remembered that her mother, her grandmother, all the women of her family had gone through humiliation, poverty, contempt, and had stood strong. She must do the same. For Amara's sake. Her prayer grew deeper, stronger. She asked not only for protection, but also for forgiveness, not for herself, but for the people who had just rejected her daughter. "Forgive them, Lord," she thought, trying to restrain her anger. "Forgive them for being blind. They can't see that there is nothing but light and love in her little heart. They don't realize what they're doing." In those moments, her thoughts returned to Amara. She looked at her daughter's face, still wet with tears, and a wave of love and determination swept over her. No matter how much she was humiliated, she would not let this destroy her dignity. The mother knew that in this injustice, one must not show weakness. She must be an example to her daughter, to show her that despite the cruelty of the world, their inner dignity remains unshaken. She pulled Amara close to her, and the words she had so often said to her daughter as she tucked her into bed rang in her heart. "You are strong, Amara. You are my pride. The world can be cruel, but you must never forget who you are. You are a blessing, and no man can take that away from you." She was repeating those words now, not just for Amara, but for herself. Her voice was quiet, but it grew firmer each time she spoke. She could feel her anger and pain giving way to strength, an inner determination to protect her daughter and give her the future she deserved. But fear still lived somewhere deep inside. It was fear for how this first experience would affect Amara. What would she take from this day? Would she be able to believe in people again? Or had her little heart already been tainted by this rejection? The mother realized that this was only the beginning. She would have to fight for her daughter's right to be accepted in a world that still did not seem ready for equality. But now, at this moment, her prayer, her love, and her steadfastness became her weapons. She knew that tomorrow, or a week from now, she would return to this world to stand up for her daughter's rights. But right now, she just needed to hold her tight, to let her feel that she was not alone. Amara raised her head. Her eyes, reddened with tears, looked at her mother with a question. Her mother hugged her tighter and whispered, "You are my strength, Amara, and you will never be alone." Those words were a promise, and deep in her heart, her mother knew that she would fulfill it at any cost. After the crowd of parents had dispersed, leaving behind only whispers and scornful glances, Ms. Clark gestured dryly and invited Amara's mother into her office. She pointed discreetly at the door, her face as if carved from stone. Not a trace of apology, not a shadow of doubt. Her demeanor said only one thing: she was the boss, and she made the decisions. Amara's mother, holding on as best she could, left her daughter in the waiting room under the care of one of the workers. Amara didn't want to let go of her hand, but her mother confidently promised that everything would be all right. Her voice sounded calm, but a storm raged inside her. She knew what awaited her behind that door, but she was still ready to face it. As she entered the office, she immediately felt the cold air of arrogance envelop her. The spacious, austere room looked as spotless as Ms. Clark herself. She stood at her massive desk without offering her mother a seat. Her posture was perfect, and her gaze was hard, even contemptuous. "Mrs." She paused, deliberately prolonging the moment. "I think we need to talk. Frankly." Amara's mother straightened up without flinching and stared straight at her. Inside, she could feel the tension building with each passing second, as if the air in the room grew thicker and heavier. "I'm ready to listen to you," she answered in a steady voice, hiding the storm of emotions. Miss Clark nodded slightly and finally sat down at the table. She folded her hands slowly, as if preparing for a long and unpleasant conversation. "Let's be honest," she began, and her voice was imbued with icy politeness. "Your visit today has caused some concerns, and I think it's fair to discuss what brought you here and why this might not be the right place for your daughter." The words sounded like a sentence, and Amara's mother felt her heart clench, but she forced herself to keep her eyes open. "My daughter has the right to be educated here like any other child," she replied firmly. Ms. Clark sighed, as if trying to show leniency to someone who she felt didn't understand the obvious. "That's your opinion, of course," she said, leaning on the table. "But in our institution, we maintain a certain standard. We provide not only education, but a special environment, an environment that fosters the development of children from similar communities. It helps to maintain harmony." Amara's mother understood exactly what she meant. It was a veiled attempt to say that their community was unnecessary here. She clenched her fists, trying to contain the anger that was boiling up inside her. "You don't think my daughter can contribute to this harmony?" she asked coldly. Ms. Clark seemed to be expecting this question. She leaned forward, her voice even quieter, but that made it sound even more threatening. "Let me be clear," she said. "We have children here from well-to-do, well-behaved families. They are used to certain standards of behavior, certain cultural practices. It may be difficult for your daughter to adapt. She may not be comfortable around these kids. And frankly, it can cause problems for others." Those words were like a blow. Amara's mother felt her breath catch. This was no longer a hidden innuendo. It was open hatred disguised as concern. "Trouble for others?" she interjected, her voice shaking with anger. "Are you saying that her presence here would be unwelcome?" Miss Clark was not embarrassed. She only raised an eyebrow slightly, as if surprised that the question had been asked at all. "I mean, sometimes it's important to think about more than that. About the collective. About how one person can impact the whole group. We strive to create a comfortable environment for everyone, and if that requires making a difficult decision, then so be it." Amara's mother took a deep breath to control her rage. She already knew that this conversation was not about her daughter, not about standards, not about harmony. It was about how Ms. Clark and so many others like her couldn't accept that people like Amara could be equal. "My daughter is not the problem," she said finally, her voice firm. "The problem is your preconceived notions. And if this place can't see her as a child with a right to education and equal treatment, then we're not the problem." Ms. Clark tilted her head slightly, her smile strained and cold. "You are certainly entitled to your opinion," she replied. "But I also have the right to protect the interests of my institution, and I am sure you will find another place that will better meet your expectations." These words were the final point in the conversation. Amara's mother stood up, maintaining a proud posture despite the pain and humiliation that gripped her from the inside. She knew she wouldn't get justice here, but she also knew she wouldn't stop until her daughter got what was her due. She left the office, leaving behind Ms. Clark and her icy indifference. But that conversation was deeply imprinted on her heart like a scar. When Amara's mother returned to the waiting room after her tense conversation with Ms. Clark, her heart ached with anger and frustration. She tried not to show her emotions, but her stiff movements and tense face gave away her inner storm. Amara was waiting for her, sitting on a low bench against the wall. She was holding a small toy car that the kindergarten staff had given her in an attempt to distract her, but her eyes no longer shone with joy as they had in the morning. Amara looked up when she saw her mother. Her small face, usually so animated, was now faded. She quietly set the machine down beside her and, without saying a word, stood up to approach her mother. The girl did not ask how the conversation ended. She felt that the answer was already written on her mother's lips and in her gaze. Her mother took her hand, and they headed for the exit. But before they could leave the building, they were again confronted by several parents who cast the same barbed glances at them as before. The whispering didn't stop, but grew even louder. It was almost explicit now. "I don't understand how they even thought they would be accepted," said one of the women standing next to a group of children. "It's obvious they don't fit in here." Amara heard those words. Her step slowed, and she turned her head slightly to look at the speaker. There was no anger in her eyes, only confusion. She didn't understand why these people were talking about her and her mom like that. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her childish mind couldn't comprehend the cruelty of adults, but her heart was already beginning to feel its poignancy. "Come on, sweetheart," her mother said quietly, trying to distract her. But it was too late. Amara had seen it all, heard it all. She felt that those words were meant for her, and for the first time in her life she realized that there was a world where people looked at her differently. Not as a child who wanted to play and learn, but as an outsider not worthy of being a part of their lives. When they left the kindergarten, her mother tried to speak to Amara, but the girl said nothing. Her small hand clutched her mother's tightly, but her head was down. Usually chatty and inquisitive, she was withdrawn now. Her silence was heavy, and her mother knew what it meant. On the drive home, Amara finally spoke, her voice weak, almost a whisper. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" The question tore the mother from the inside out. She stopped, knelt down in front of her daughter and hugged her. Her heart was breaking, but she knew she had to be strong. She looked at her daughter's face, so innocent, but now with a shadow that shouldn't have been there. "No, my girl," she said, trying to speak firmly. "You haven't done anything. You're perfect. The problem isn't you. It's the people who can't see the light you bring." But Amara couldn't hold her emotions in any longer. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she sobbed quietly. "They looked at me like I was bad. Like I'm not like them. Why, Mom?" Her mother hugged her even tighter, trying to reassure her. She did not know how to answer the question in a way that would not destroy the child's faith in justice, but she could see that some of that faith had already been lost. Amara began to realize that there are some things that cannot be fixed with words or acts of kindness. There are biases that are beyond her control, but that still hurt. They stood on the sidewalk for a long time, hugging each other as the world around them continued to go on. For Amara, this day was a lesson she shouldn't have learned so early. She saw that not all doors open equally for every child, and that some of them need to be fought for, even when you don't want to fight at all. The mother got up, wiped the tears from Amara's face, and said, "We'll find another place where you'll be loved and respected. You deserve the best. Don't ever forget that." But deep down, she knew this moment would stay with Amara for a long time. The girl no longer felt like everyone else. Her smile, once so bright, was gone. She began to see the world differently, a world where not everyone was willing to accept her with open arms just because of how she looked. When she returned home, Amara's mother tried to maintain a semblance of calm, but inside she was torn with pain and humiliation. She wrapped Amara in a blanket, sat her on the couch, and turned on her favorite cartoon, even though she knew it wouldn't help. The girl still looked depressed. Her usually bright eyes were dimmed, and even the cartoons that always made her laugh seemed indifferent. Her mother looked at her and felt her rage rising. It was more than resentment for herself. It was pain for her daughter, whose innocence had been shattered in an instant. She knew she had to do something. The injustice they faced could not go unanswered. Trying not to let her emotions show in front of Amara, she went into the kitchen and picked up her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number. After a few beeps, a familiar, calm voice answered the phone. "Hi," he replied. "How was Amara's first day?" Her throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. Her voice sounded steady, but with each passing second there was more bitterness in it. "Not what we expected," she said. "You know, this kindergarten, they didn't accept her." There was a short pause. She heard him take a deep breath, but his voice remained calm, almost icy. "Why?" he asked. She explained it briefly, uncluttered, but every word was drenched in pain. She told of the cold reception, the humiliation from Miss Clark, the ridicule from the other parents, and the first time Amara realized that she was not distinguished for her intelligence or kindness, but for the color of her skin. On the other side of the wire there was silence again. Then he spoke, and his voice was hard as steel. "I'm going over there," the mother tried to object. She knew he would be adamant when it came to their daughter, but she didn't want the situation to escalate. She could already imagine the cold stares they would get again, how this could turn into another humiliation. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," he answered firmly. "They need to hear who Amara is, and they need to realize that their actions will not go unchallenged." She was silent, clutching the phone in her hand. There was a strength and confidence in his words that she had lost after everything that had happened. She sensed that this conversation was going to be something that Ms. Clark and her standards would not expect. "I'll be there in an hour," he added. "And you'll be there. We'll figure it out together." Her mother hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. She looked at Amara, who was still sitting on the couch with her arms around her knees. The girl looked lost. She walked over, put her arms around her, and whispered, "It's gonna be okay, honey. Daddy's gonna be here soon." Amara looked up at her mother. There was still pain and misunderstanding in her gaze, but now there was a small spark of hope. She knew that her father had always been a protector to her. Even if she didn't see how he could make a difference, his presence was enough to make her feel safe. Mother knew that the hour before his arrival would be the longest. She couldn't predict how it would all end, but her heart told her that this conversation would be nothing like the last. It would be a conversation that would make Miss Clark look at them differently. The anxious wait lasted for ages. Amara's mother tried to remain calm, but she was filled with conflicting feelings. On the one hand, she hoped that her husband's arrival would make a difference, but on the other hand, she feared that their efforts would be shattered by the wall of prejudice they faced. When there was a knock at the door, Amara looked up. Her mother opened the door quickly and saw him, the tall, confident figure of Amara's father. His presence immediately filled the space, as if power itself had entered with him. He was dressed simply but elegantly. Dark suit, perfectly ironed shirt, shoes polished to a shine. There was a calmness and hardness in his eyes that was impossible to ignore. "Where's Amara?" he asked quietly, walking into the room. The mother pointed to the couch where their daughter was sitting. Amara rushed to him at once, her small arms around his neck. He lifted her in his arms, as if to remind her that nothing was more important to him than her well-being. His face softened for a moment, but then became serious again. "Are you all right, my princess?" he asked. Amara nodded, but there was still a shadow of what had happened that morning in her eyes. Setting his daughter on the floor, he looked at the mother. "We'll go together," he said, and there was a confidence in his voice that reassured her a little. "She needs to hear who we are." The two of them entered the kindergarten building, Amara staying behind to wait in the car with one of their friends. Their footsteps were confident. Their father's gaze was direct, and his posture unyielding. This was no longer the visit of a family asking for a favor. It was the entrance of people who knew their worth and were ready to assert their dignity. Ms. Clark, who was at her massive desk in the study, heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. When the door opened, she looked up. Her face changed for a moment, a slight tinge of worry running across her features, but she quickly pulled herself together. Her usual cold gaze was back, but now it was a little wary. Amara's father did not wait for the invitation. He entered the office with the girl's mother without distracting himself with formalities. His gaze rested at once on Miss Clark, and there was not a shadow of doubt in it. She, accustomed to being the mistress of the situation, felt her habitual superiority beginning to falter. "Minus Miss Clark," he began, his voice steady but sounding like a steel blade. "I'm Amara's father. I think we have a lot to talk about." Miss Clark flinched, but maintained her cold manner. She nodded slightly, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Good afternoon," she said, folding her hands on the table. "I understand you want to discuss the situation that has arisen?" "Right," he answered, not looking away from her. His voice was quiet, but it was threatening. "A situation you've created, and one that I'm sure you have to explain." Amara's mother stood beside him, her face hard, her eyes shining with determination. This was the moment they had come not to ask, but to demand respect, justice, and their daughter's right to be treated equally. Ms. Clark, despite her usual confidence, felt pressured. The presence of these men, their calm but unyielding posture, seemed to displace her usual sense of authority from the room. She tried to maintain her position. "I'm sure we can come to some sort of compromise," she began, but her voice trembled slightly. "However, as I explained to your wife, our kindergarten is held to high standards, which—" Amara's father raised his hand, stopping her. The gesture was soft, but its meaning was clear. He would not let her escape responsibility for her words and actions. "I'm not here to hear your excuses, Ms. Clark," he said. "I'm here to remind you that my daughter has the same rights as any other child in this institution, and I want to know why you think otherwise." Ms. Clark tensed, her face pale. She realized that this meeting was going to be very different from the morning's conversation. Ms. Clark sat at her massive desk, trying to keep her composure, but there was a flicker of concern in her gaze. Amara's father stood directly in front of her, his eyes cold and sharp as ice. The girl's mother stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze expressing barely restrained anger. "Do we have a high standard?" his father said, his voice soft but even more menacing. "Do you really want me to believe that pathetic excuse?" Ms. Clark straightened up, trying to regain her command of the conversation. "I'm sure you realize," she began, with false politeness, "that our institution requires a certain level of cultural appropriateness. We want all the children to be comfortable." "Comfortable?" Amara's mother interrupted her, her voice trembling with indignation. "Do you think our daughter makes you uncomfortable? She's a child, Miss Clark, a little girl who just wanted to learn and play. But instead, you humiliated her in front of all those parents." "It was not a humiliation," the director replied coldly. "It was a decision I felt was right for the staff. We care about our students." "Didn't look like her?" Her father interrupted her again, his voice louder. "Say it outright, Ms. Clark. Admit that you turned her down just because of the color of her skin. Or, do you have something I'm missing?" Ms. Clark was confused. Her usual cold-blooded facade began to crack. She averted her gaze but tried to excuse herself. "That's not true, Mr. she stammered, realizing she hadn't even bothered to remember their last name. "Daniels," my father said calmly. "Dr. Daniels. And this is my wife, Anna Daniels. And I guess you didn't bother to find out who we were either." Ms. Clark was wary but said nothing. "Let me explain," he continued, his tone becoming more and more determined. "I'm a surgeon of 20 years' experience, and I own 2 clinics in this city. My wife is an attorney specializing in civil rights. We are part of this community, and we came here with the hope that our daughter would become part of your institution." Ms. Clark squinted, her voice growing colder. "Do you think your status makes any difference?" "And isn't that so?" Anna replied sharply. "You talk about compliance and high standards, but you don't realize that you are missing the chance to get our support. This kindergarten could have gotten grants, new infrastructure, partnerships. But you decided to close the door on our daughter. Why?" Miss Clark fell silent, realizing that the conversation was out of her control. She tried to maintain her dignity, but her voice shook. "I will not be threatened." Amara's father frowned, his face expressing disappointment. "Threaten?" he asked. "We're not threatening. We are showing you that there are real consequences behind your bias. Your daycare center needs support, not racism that destroys parental trust." Anna stepped closer to the table, her voice firm. "We could have been your allies. Instead, you chose humiliation. This isn't just your failure, Ms. Clark. It's your choice, and it's your responsibility." Ms. Clark sat with her hands clasped together, her fingers trembling slightly. The calmness she was accustomed to displaying was shattered. Dr. Daniels's voice and Anna's steady gaze had taken away her confidence. I don't think it was fair to describe my actions as racist." Her voice shook and she looked away. "It wasn't true." "Not true?" Anna interrupted sharply, her eyes flashing. "You didn't look at her abilities, didn't recognize her, didn't even give her a chance, just because of the way she looks. What do you call that, if not racism?" Ms. Clark tried to get up, but her knees buckled and she sank back into the chair. She ran her hand over her forehead, as if trying to calm herself. "It's been a hard day," she mumbled, her voice growing quieter. "I just wanted to make things right for everyone." "For everyone?" Dr. Daniels' voice cut through her excuses like a knife. "Or for those who fit into your narrow, limited view of the world?" The principal stood up abruptly, but her hands were shaking. "I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I was thinking about the kids, about the parents. Those who look like you," Anna added coldly. "And you didn't think about our daughter, her feelings, her future, Doesn't that mean anything to you? Yeah, I just... Minus Miss Clark couldn't finish. Her face turned ash gray. She couldn't find the words. Her mask collapsed, leaving confusion and fear of the consequences. Amara's father and Anna walked out of Miss Clark's office, leaving the principal sitting silent, almost paralyzed. But they weren't about to stop. This time they headed straight for the hallway, where several parents were gathered. "What are you going to do?" Anna whispered, leaning slightly toward her husband. "Let's show them what's behind their standards," he replied firmly. The parents, noticing their appearance, were immediately alert. The whispers died down. Some continued to stare at them with the same arrogant disdain. Others just waited. "I want you all to know what just happened," Daniels began loudly. His voice echoed down the hall. "Today, my daughter, a 5-year-old girl, was rejected by this institution. Why? Because of the color of her skin." There was movement in the crowd. Some frowned, some clearly tried to hide their awkwardness, but the silence was deafening. "Do you support this?" Anna continued, looking into the eyes of her closest parents. "Do you think it is normal that children are humiliated and rejected just because they are different from yours? This is absurd." One of the mothers was indignant, but her voice was uncertain. "It must be some kind of misunderstanding." "No," Daniels cut her off. "It's a system where some people think they're superior to others, and it breaks down when we start telling the truth." "Don't you have anything to say?" Anna asked, looking around at everyone. "Because if you don't say anything, then you are part of the problem." Many lowered their eyes. No one ventured an answer. But the awkwardness in the air was palpable. The truth, spoken loudly, had already begun to shatter the usual excuses. The whispers in the crowd grew louder and louder until they were interrupted by the sharp creak of a door. Ms. Clark came out of her office. Her face was pale, her eyes dull. She looked around at her parents and the Daniels and froze. The pressure was palpable. I need to say something." Her voice shook, but she tried to sound collected. "I admit that I made a mistake today. A mistake in my decision today." "A mistake?" Anna questioned loudly, her tone cold. "Is this what you call blatant discrimination?" Ms. Clark clenched her hands, her confidence finally crumbling. "I apologize," she said, trying to speak louder. "To your family, to your daughter. It was unacceptable." Amara's father crossed his arms over his chest. "So what's next? You think one apology is enough?" His voice was low but threatening. "How many more children have you rejected because of your standards?" Ms. Clark glanced at the crowd of parents, trying to find support, but no one spoke. Her voice shook. "We will review our policy. Yeah, I assure you this will not happen again." "I doubt it," Anna said dryly. "Your words sound as hollow as your politics." Miss Clark backed away, her pride broken, but her apology, like her confidence, already seemed empty. Amara's mother and father returned to the car where their daughter was waiting in the back seat. Amara's mother and father returned to the car where their daughter was waiting in the back seat. "What's wrong, Mom? Daddy?" Her voice was quiet, wary. Anna knelt down in front of Amara, hugged her, and said in a whisper, "It's okay, honey. We told them who you are. And they realized they were wrong." Amara looked at her father. They're not angry now?" she asked, her eyes filled with hope. "No," he answered confidently, lifting her into his arms. "They're not mad because you're stronger than their words. You're the most amazing girl, and no one can change that." Amara sobbed, but instead of tears, a slight smile appeared on her face. "Really?" she whispered, snuggling into his shoulder. "Absolutely," Anna said, running her hand through her curls. "We're proud of you, and this world will be too." Amara, feeling her parents' warmth and love, smiled genuinely for the first time that day. Her faith in goodness was beginning to return. In the evening, sitting at the kitchen table, the family discussed the day's events. Amara listened attentively to her parents, her eyes shining with interest. "Why did they do that?" she asked, looking at her father. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand," he replied softly. "That doesn't mean you have to put up with their bad attitudes. You have to show them who you are." "But what if they don't change?" Her voice trembled. Anna put a hand on her shoulder. "You're gonna be strong, honey. And if someone looks only at your looks, remember, that's their problem, not yours. You're a person, and no one can take that away." "We took a step today," the father added, "but there will be many more to come. We will fight it together." Amara smiled, looking at her parents. She nodded and said quietly, "I'll do my best, so they can see what I'm like." That night was a lesson to the family that change begins with those who are not afraid to speak out against injustice. They knew there was still a long way to go, but they were confident that every step counted. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you or someone close to you experienced racism? How have you dealt with these situations? Your stories and opinions are incredibly important to us, and we sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if you like this story. Your likes and subscriptions help us to share these important stories with more people. May your day be kind, bright, and full of warmth. Thank you for being with us.